we're live, Mona.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our third Co-opting AI event in the fall 2020 season. Definitely a memorable year. This is our 18th Co-opting AI event overall since we started in the spring of 2019. And I'm so very excited for today's session. A little passion project that has been building that has finally come to fruition. And tonight we will be talking about artificial intelligence and fiction. After focusing much on AI and policy over the course of this year and also last year, I think it's really time to examine the role of AI narratives and imaginaries, many of which really fuel our thinking and our perception of artificial intelligence. And in fact, policymaking around AI, but even much broader about kind of what socio-technical futures we are imagining. Now, tonight I'm joined by a really fantastic group of scholars and practitioners who are experts in this field. Malka Alder, Sheena Howard, and Beth Singler. And joining me as a co-host tonight is my wonderful colleague at the Tandon School of Engineering, Danya Glabau. My name is Mona Sloane. I'm a sociologist at New York University. I work on inequality in the context of AI design and policy. I am a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge. I work with the GovLab. I'm an associate with NYU's Alliance for Public Interest Technology. I have the pleasure of teaching a group of fantastic students at NYU's Tandon School for Engineering. And I also work with the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU on a little project on the climate emergency and methods and modes of extraction. I convene the Co-opting AI series here at IPK, as well as the Shift series. And I work with Public Books as their technology editor. Now, this series, none of these 18 events and more that will be coming would be possible with the really, truly generous support and sponsorship of the Institute for Public Knowledge, the 370J Project, and NYU's Department of Technology, Culture, and Society. And I want to underline that it's so important that we can keep going with this series at times where budgets are really strained in the pandemic. Before I introduce my guests and say a few words to frame the conversation tonight, I want to acknowledge that by being in New York City, I'm standing on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. And I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community and the indigenous communities on whose land you are currently standing, and to commit to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Please also join me in thanking all the essential workers who work tirelessly to keep us safe every day here in New York City and everywhere around the globe, many of whom are exhausted already at a time where we are seeing infections numbers go through the roof again. I want to express my commitment to the Black Lives Matter movement and the ongoing project to tackle white privilege and systemic racism, and to develop anti-racist culture in our communities and institutions. There's no better time than now, really, especially in this country after an election that has seen record numbers of people claim their right to vote for whatever it took, and I commend them. And I want to once more borrow the words from Arundhati Roy in saying that the pandemic is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. How can we imagine that next world and our safe passing through the gateway? Now, speculating about the future is part of the human condition, and our speculations often entail imaginations of technology, such as intelligent machines. Today, fiction and speculative fiction continue to shape politics, innovation, and power, and AI has become a prominent and global site for this dynamic. In the conversation tonight, we want to examine how fiction has shaped our narratives around technology and AI specifically, and how it can help us speculate about socio-technical futures differently. Now, without further ado, please let me introduce my co-host tonight, and as well as the distinguished panel. So Dr. Danya Glabau, joining me in co-moderation tonight, is an SCS scholar and medical anthropologist and industry assistant professor and director of the Science and Technology Studies program in the Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. Her first book in progress, titled Reproducing Safety, Food Allergy Advocacy and the Politics of Care, with University of Minnesota Press, examines the reproductive politics of food allergy advocacy in the United States. Her second book, which she casually has in the making at the same time, is called Cyborg with MIT Press and is co-authored with the wonderful Laura Forlano, who is at the IIT Institute of Design. This book will offer an introduction to feminist cyborg theory for scholarly, technical, and non-scholarly audiences. She also is a faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research since 2015. Now over to the panelists, and I'm so excited for this. Starting the conversation tonight will be Beth Singler, Dr. Beth Singler, apologies, who is the Junior Research Fellow in Artificial Intelligence at Homerton College at the University of Cambridge. Her anthropological research explores the stories we tell ourselves about artificial intelligence and robotics, as well as their social, ethical, philosophical, and religious implications. As an experienced digital ethnographer, Beth also explores these perceptions through public engagement as a filmmaker, speaker, and creative writer. She has produced documentaries on AI, and the first, called Pain in the Machine, won the 2017 AHRC Best Research Film of the Year award. She was one of the Evening Standard's Progress 1000 in both 2017 and 18, and in 2020, she was one of the 21 to watch. She has spoken at the Hay Festival, the London Science Museum, the Edinburgh Science Festival, Ars Electronica, and New Scientist Live. Welcome, Beth.
Hey.
Beth will be followed by Dr. Sheena C. Howard, who is an award-winning author, filmmaker and scholar, and associate professor of communication at Rider University. In 2014, Dr. Howard became the first Black woman to win an Eisner Award for her first book, Black Comics, Politics of Race and Representation, 2013. She's also the author of several critically acclaimed books and comics books. In 2017, Dr. Howard published the Encyclopedia of Black Comics, which is the first book of its kind, profiling over 100 Black people in the comics industry, and was named the 2018 American Library Association's Outstanding Reference Source. In 2016, Dr. Howard directed, produced, and wrote the documentary Remixing Colorblind, which explores the ways the educational system shapes our perception of race. In 2014, Dr. Howard published Black Queer Identity Matrix and Critical Articulations of Race, Gender, and Sexual Orientation. Dr. Howard is the co-writer of the comic book Superb, about a teenage superhero with Down syndrome. She has appeared on NPR, ABC, BBC, PBS, as well as other networks and documentaries as an expert on popular culture, politics, and social justice. She's the subject of a 2018 Emmy-nominated episode of State of the Arts and has twice received a proclamation from the city of Philadelphia for her literary work, social justice, and creative projects. Welcome, Dr. Howard. Welcome, Sheena. Thanks for joining. Following Dr. Howard will be Dr. Malka Alder with the last contribution of the panelist. She is a writer, aid worker, and sociologist, and I'm always excited to welcome other sociologists to the show. Her science fiction political thriller, Infomocracy. You have to help me here, Malka.
You got it, Infomocracy.
Thank you. Was named one of the best books of 2016 by Kirkus, Book Riot, and the Washington Post. She's the creator of the serial Ninth Step Station, currently running on Serial Box, and her short story collection, And Other Disasters, came out in November 19. She's a faculty associate at Arizona State University School for the Future of Innovation and Society, and her opinions can be found in the New York Times, The Nation, and Foreign Policy, among other places. A very warm welcome to this terrific panel. Now, just a few words about housekeeping. We will be hearing from each panelist for about 10 minutes. In the meantime, Team IPK will be collecting questions on social media, primarily through Twitter, which is IPK_NYU. We will, after the contributions of our panelists, start a panel conversation and then sort of move over to integrate questions from the audience. And then Dr. Glabau will be closing us off with some surely very insightful thoughts. This session will be recorded and live streamed onto Twitter. It will be available later with captions through IPK's YouTube channel. Now, it's time for me to shut up, and I'm going to hand over to Beth for her first contribution. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this fantastic panel. I'm very honored. And now I'm just fingers crossed that I can get this to work for the second time this evening and share my screen so you can see my presentation. Let's see. Let's press that and that. Here we go. Is he going to do it? Okay, so I'm going to talk this evening for my time, late afternoon for yours, about my anthropological work into the stories we tell ourselves about artificial intelligence and what living in those stories means as well, and where those stories have impact on lives. So a lot of my work is around anxiety and doing work on the concept of anthropology of anxiety, looking at the discourse and discussion around where people are afraid and scared of artificial intelligence and robots. Now, of course, there are many different types of stories about AI. They all provoke emotional reactions, and all, I think, are an invitation to view artificial intelligence in a particular way. So this obviously being a more humorous one. We also have viral memes and stories that set the scene for our conversation about AI in particular ways. So even though this meme here, which you may recognize from The Simpsons, reworked slightly to be concerned with robotics and robots, even though this is a humorous presentation, it's also, again, this concern of the robot uprising and fears and anxiety. Some are more expressively directed in this way. This is an image from Ashes of the Singularity, which is a computer game where you have this sort of standard robo-apocalypse, the uprising, the thing that's going to happen to destroy everything. And some of these stories and narratives are very predominant, they shape the conversation, and partly this is due to the iterative effect of the press and media using these sorts of images from science fiction stories and narratives and shaping the conversation in that direction, even if the actual advances in AI technology might be incremental, might be relatively mundane in some cases, but the actual ways in which these stories are presented, and I have some examples here, obviously, of the Terminator imagery that predominates in the press, in the media, that gives a kind of presumption about what the outcome is going to be with artificial intelligence and where we're headed. And again, as I say, I'm very interested in these anxious outputs, but then also how that is expressed in the public discourse that we're seeing online as well. And when we face the Terminator as this dominating story, we're actually placing ourselves into the position of the, I suppose in some case, the righteous warrior who fights back. By seeing the Terminator in front of us so often, we are in this reflective position here, but it can actually be even more than that. And I think it's interesting to note that the John Connor character in the Terminator series is the one who's changed faces the most, as our idea of the chosen one changes and evolves. And actually this illustration here doesn't include the most recent Terminator film, where it's no longer John Connor at all, but a female character. And we're seeing the idea of chosenness evolving over time with our stories. Some people are quite dismissive of the Terminator as a shorthand to this apocalyptic idea, but it says a lot about our cultural context at the same time. And I want to tie in these ideas of the apocalyptic incident and the changes that we're thinking about with these stories to survivalism and the actual real life prepper culture that thinks about the apocalypse in many different ways. And I have this quote here from Mitchell's book, Dancing at Armageddon, about how this is about grand storytelling, placing ourselves into the not quite here yet future that we can try and face against. And there's the narrative of the brave warrior again, and what kinds of preparations and survival systems we would have to deal with this apocalyptic future that would center us as the righteous that we don't have necessarily in our day-to-day lives. And I think it's interesting also to think about this apocalyptic thinking in the light of how quickly fiction moves to non-fiction and our apprehensions. So for example, this is a short clip from a web series, about Adam the Robot, which was created with the Unity game engine. This is CGI. When it was first released, this clip online, it was very clear. It came with the context that this was a sample from the web series, but very quickly, fiction can be denuded of context when people are afraid of what they're seeing. So for example, Darren Brown, the British magician, and well, he does some sort of mind tricks. He's very explicit that what he's doing is a trick. His response here to this imagery is very simple. We are all going to die, in capital letters. Again, this anxious response on social media that I'm looking at. But here again, it's the fictional element slipping into the non-fiction as our apprehensions are mistaken. And I think there's several forces accounts of other minds that we get from our stories and our narratives, and the non-fictional accounts of other minds as people are developing technology that actually exists in the real world, as well as our fears about perceived minds and what they want. And I draw there on Mary Douglas's work, the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who talked about matter out of place. When we see things that we think are human-like in various ways, we perceive a mind that isn't there, and seeing that that mind is in somewhere that we were not expecting, leads us onto this sense of taboo, even abject terror and horrors, and we see in the sort of the apocalyptic response. And there is slippage, as I say, between these non-fictional accounts of minds and the fictional accounts of minds, as with Adam the robot. People responding to it as though it's absolutely real and terrifying. And I call this Wellesian slippage to hark back to Orson Welles' accounts, his representation of the War of the Worlds, the performance that some people, perhaps not as many as history reports, but some people found utterly, utterly terrifying because they did not realize that it was this fictional moment. And some people sort of push on these permeable boundaries between fiction and non-fictional accounts of other minds. So for example, Sophia, who I often refer to as a phobot, a fake robot, because of the element of puppetry and how that she operates, that I've spoken at length with chatbot experts who say her inner workings are not as advanced as she is presented. If you follow her on Twitter, she chats away about various different things. That's obviously a social media manager rather than Sophia the robot. But this line again between the fictional robot and the non-fictional robots is blurred. And even a few years ago, there was a panel at Cognition X, the big festival here for technology and artificial intelligence, about the dangers of anthropomorphism and discussion of Sophia in particular, and Hanson Robotics, who are behind her. So in some instances, they'll refer to her as character art and a research development platform to explore how people interact with robots, it says, or makes comparison with artistic works, that she is a creative project, but not actually as advanced, perhaps, as they are claiming. And there's these blurred lines again between the reality and the hype. And this leads, as I said, onto these anxious responses. So here I have some examples of some tweets where people are drawing both on the fiction of the Terminator series and the representation of the Sophia the robot to actually be quite scared of her, talking about how she's the real deal. Apparently now we've all forgotten how Terminator started, references to Skynet, to how the satellites will rain down her vengeance upon us, not Skynet's, but actually a parallel is drawn, and the statement that someone needs to come back from the future to kill Sophia the robot. So these lines are blurring in some instances between fiction and non-fiction, and that has an effect on our apocalyptic thinking. I'm quite taken by this interpretation by Stephen King from his book Danse Macabre about why horror in particular, not science fiction necessarily, but the horrific, is so appealing for some people, that in the fictional account of horror, you get to the end of the ride. He uses the analogy of going on the roller coaster ride, and I've updated him a little bit. That could be your best girl, or your best guy, or whoever, but you go on the roller coaster ride in this account, but there's this feeling of reintegration and safety at the end. It's all okay once the horror ride is over. So even the scary robot, as I have the image there, in science fiction, ultimately is defeated. In the case of the Terminator, the defeat can happen several times because it's a franchise, but we still get this feeling at the end that something has been completed. And if we return to these different aspects in tension, where can this reintegration happen? It can happen in fictional accounts of other minds, but it doesn't necessarily happen in non-fictional accounts of other minds. So where there's this permeable boundary, there's this sense of incompleteness, which feeds again into the apocalyptic scenarios, the survivalist scenarios that say the future is coming, it's near, it's close, I'm going to have a specifically important role in it. But that sense of reintegration and finality and closure isn't necessarily there for some of these people who are having these apocalyptic responses and anxious responses online. So just to quickly sum, We were talking here in my work about anxiety, the apocalyptic, and how we place ourselves in those AI narratives and stories that we are telling each other, that we're telling ourselves, that our response to even footage here of the Boston Dynamics bipedal prototype robot, we're sort of placing ourselves in the shoes of the human, your face here, as I've craftily created in MS Paint, very, very advanced technology I use, but this sense that we place ourselves in the story, and that has an impact on our emotions, our affective response, and quite often that is anxiety. So I'm going to finish there. There's my contact details if anyone's interested, and I hope that's been of interest to people who are watching.
Thank you so much, Beth. Really appreciate it. What a wonderful introduction to the world of AI narratives and the robot takeover, which is something I discuss a lot with my students as well. And I can't wait to discuss more. I don't know if it's me, but your video froze, Beth.
Yeah, I'm frozen. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine. Just your video is frozen.
I think, oh, there you go. I think it's okay now. It's just because I canceled the screen share, it hiccuped a bit.
Great. Please let me hand over the screen to Sheena.
Hello, hello. I am going to share my screen as well. And no need for introduction since I got a wonderful introduction from Mona. I am thrilled to be here and to be talking a little bit about my work, my approach to fiction and technology. So I consider myself an image activist. I am a scholar that has studied comics, comic books, superheroes, Black comic strips, Black comics, gender representation in comics for over 10 years now. And the last, I'd say 3 years, I have been writing comic books, doing graphic novel adaptations, and also writing fiction. And so I've built my talk today around sort of 3 questions that just came to mind when I got the invitation from Mona to talk about co-opting AI and fiction. And so through these 3 questions that I'm just going to explore in my talk, I'm also going to be talking a little bit about my work in how I approach image activism in fiction and how I see technology and AI playing into all of that. So the first question is, what is science fiction's role in the technology space? I think sometimes, you know, for scientists, right, and for artists as well, we might not readily see those 2 things combining. You know, as a writer, you know, I go into my silo and I write. I don't necessarily go reach out to like scientists when I'm writing a comic book or thinking about, you know, my sci-fi stories. And so part of this talk is really going to be a call to action for our students that are watching this, but as well as, you know, scholars and scientists who are watching this. So I know we talk a lot about STEM and getting people of color into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, but I'm all about STEAM, right? Science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And I want to be intentional about really bridging those gaps and bridging those gaps for young students at a really early age, because I think we can do so many more powerful things and have so many more powerful discussions around social justice and inequality, which I know Mona is all about because I've read some of her papers. So when we talk about science fiction, you know, there's a lot of different definitions for science fiction, but in general, we're talking about, you know, stories that incorporate new technologies, use technologies, but really important, explore, you know, the consequences of technology, right? The like Beth was talking about, some of our fears around technology are present in some of our favorite fiction books and movies, right? And so there's sort of this, you know, bi-directional relationship going on where new technologies are often created, right, in science fiction, right, or often serve as inspiration, right, to real life, but also real technologies are dealt with in science fiction that again consider, you know, the possibilities and dangers of technology. So we all sort of remember, these three sort of shows or movies. We have one of, the modern series Black Mirror, which I love, but it deals with sort of, how technology can go really wrong, right? We have, flies that turn into robots and then start, killing people, right? We have technology where, you can delete people out of your life, right? You can delete your ex and silence them out of your life. And so we all remember Star Trek, right? The inspiration for, a mobile phone. And then of course, we've been talking about like hoverboards since Back to the Future, right? And so you can see some of these movies, right? And I haven't even gotten to how books have inspired things to come to fruition in real life, right? And so there's that bi-directional relationship. And when I approach fiction writing, if I'm writing a comic book or a fiction story, I think about this sort of, bi-directional approach. And one of the things that you want to do when you're writing a fiction story and you're incorporating technology and AI, right? You want it to be futuristic, right? Some cool technology, right? But you also want the reader and the viewer to really think that this technology is possible, right? You're kind of, like Beth was saying, blurring the lines between fiction and nonfiction. Think, the hoverboard, right? When we're watching the hoverboard in like the 80s and 90s, we're thinking that's cool, and we're thinking that probably is something that might be able to happen in, the future, that sort of thing. One of the books that I was a co-writer on is a comic book called Superb, and it actually features a teenage superhero with Down syndrome. And as I said in the introduction, I like to combine my fiction writing with social justice and representation, right? Representing underrepresented groups in my work and representing them in a way that I hope that people can be proud of. And so in this comic book, we have Jonah, who you see there in the picture. He has these kind of like these goggles on, right? And those are part of his superhero capabilities. And one of the things that we talked about when we were writing this comic book was, we were talking about, okay, well, there are Google glasses, and what do Google glasses really do, and how can we build on them in this comic book to think about how those glasses can be used in the future. But in addition, we were thinking about Jonah as a character with Down syndrome and thinking about some technology around building out that character. And one of the conversations that we had when we were creating, this story around Jonah is we thought that we would create some technology that would actually erase his Down syndrome. But then in our discussions, right, we're like, no, Jonah likes who he is, right? Jonah, he wouldn't want to be, somebody else or something else. And just thinking about fiction as a powerful medium that can be a medium for social justice as it's connected to technology, as it's connected to these conversations around inequality, and what that can mean in material life for the people that are reading these stories and being inspired by these stories. And so my second question is how to merge writing, technology, and representation. And so I talked a little bit about this in the beginning, that I have been intentionally advocating for a bridging of the fields. And so I'm a communication scholar, right, that studied comics and then became a comic book writer and a fiction book writer. But what if an astronomer or a math professor or someone studying physics actually were to engage with fiction and create a story, right? Think about the possibilities, right? Think about what we could create sort of in this realm, in both fields, in technology, right? Since fiction does inspire technology, but also in the writing and fiction and nonfiction world. I was reading an article while I was preparing for this presentation, and it was talking about the use of facial recognition by law enforcement, and how facial recognition, one study found that 35% of the time it got the face wrong of Black women. So it was an incorrect match, right, when identifying Black women, right? That's a very high percentage that obviously would be detrimental to communities of color when we're talking about policing. And think about a scholar that might be engaging with this research that then engages with, fiction, whether it's a comic book, whether it's a fiction story, to bring a larger audience into the fold about inequality in technology, right? One of the things that I'm kind of most proud of, in that I do write fiction and do write comic books and have a background in academia, is that I can kind of reach a larger audience with these larger important questions that we're talking about and asking here. And again, I want to be really intentional, especially in inspiring, students that may be watching this presentation, to sort of to think about how to bridge those gaps and think about how to engage with these super important questions around inequality and technology. Here's one of my books that's coming out in February. It's called Why Wakanda Matters: What Black Panther Reveals About Psychology, Identity, and Communication. And of course, the movie Black Panther was a big hit, and it's all about, right, technology. It's all about sort of Afrofuturism, right? It's all about, what if an African nation had this technology and it was untouched by colonialism, right? Reimagining the future, reimagining the past, and opening up sort of those larger questions, right? And then my final question is, how do we expand, academic research, the intersection of technology, inequality, and social justice to a wider audience? And so I gave you a general call to action, right, about bridging these fields, working together across fields. But some really specific things that I would like to see going forward are, endowed chair positions in academia around these conversations, right? Think about an endowed chair position around Afrofuturism and inequality in technology, right? Think about endowed chair positions around all sorts of these intersections around co-opting AI and fiction, and the larger questions and things that we can create when we kind of think in a more inclusive way, instead of thinking about fields that are separate. For example, MIT approached me about doing a graphic novel adaptation of a scholarly book of theirs, right? And so those sort of combinations and interactions that can really be a powerful bridge but between the intersections that we're talking about. And then in general, foundations funding research around this stuff, but research in this sort of inclusive intersectional way. And NYU, I'd love an endowed chair position around this, so keep that in mind if you're watching. And I'm at around the 11-minute mark, so I'll stop there, and I look forward to engaging in some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheena. So appreciated, especially the to-do list. We'll keep that in mind. Yes. My absolute pleasure to hand over to Malka to close off the panelist round before we start the conversation between all of us.
Thank you so much, Mona, for having me here, everyone for listening, and also my co-panelists, because those presentations were both fascinating and I really enjoyed and learned from them. I am coming to this with the sort of also dual hat that most of us have. On the one hand, I've worked on commissions to look at how science fiction affects policy, and I've looked at the AI side of that. But I also have been asked to write stories about AI several times, and every time I find it a challenge. And one of them I wrote because I wanted to, but the other two were requested, and I found it such a challenge because it is an area that has had this like accretion of these layers of the sorts of things that both my co-panelists were talking about, these images and these ideas, and it makes it very hard to come up with something that's really fresh and new. So the things that I have been interested in when I want to write about AI are really how we can look at it in some different way. And so I'm going to read from one of my stories about AI now. I don't have slides, so you get the dim lit night view of my face instead, which is kind of appropriate for this story, because this story is about a journalist in the future who is visiting the site of an AI that stopped functioning. And the story is called The Legacy. I'm reading an excerpt, so I've cut some of the more atmospheric pieces to make sure it fit into the time. But you can read the full thing either on the Decameron Project Patreon site or on the site for the Other Futures Festival. Leoka sat down carefully on the bed and hugged herself. I am inside Michalai, she thought in amazement. I am inside its brain. Well, perhaps not the brain itself, but close. The ear canal, say. I am inside the ear canal of a dead intelligence. She laughed at herself and went to splash water on her face. She met most of the other scientists at lunch, which was mostly beans and tomatoes from the hydroponics. Only one of the forensic programmers, Reina Naumov, was at the mess. The others were eating in front of their screens. Many, many lines of code, Naumov shrugged. They love it too much. Leoka picked at her beans. They were good, but she didn't want to finish too fast. So, what are you all doing here? She imagined a hand-picked team working together to save the world. But the scientists looked at each other and shrugged. Research grants, answered Selina Filipova, a narrow woman with the thickened skin and voice of a smoker. My personal specialization is the sociology of technology that doesn't progress in the way we expect, that has a disconnect with society's idea of progress. So, she raised her hands expressively. Leoka turned her gaze to Roser Blanchard, who nodded. As a cyborg anthropologist, this is the most interesting and fruitful place for me to be. It is true, Michalai is no longer interacting, but we have the records here, and it is very important work. Can you tell me what happened? This isn't how Leoka had planned to do her interviews, en masse, over food, starting at the end of the story, but she can't keep herself from asking. What always happens, Filipova answered. People expect technology to exist independent of their efforts. They start to take it for granted, they forget to pay the electricity bills, and poof. They didn't forget to pay the electricity bills, says Kveta Clement, the AI theorist. Her gray hair looked like it had been cropped for convenience and then grown out in the salonless environment of the lab and had a bright streak of green down one side. It was a decision. It was a collective decision, Filipova inserted. Not a single one. It was a number of small decisions, omissions. They both took the AI for granted and were frightened of it, Blanchard put in. We can see in the documents from the time, as though it had been 20 years or 50 instead of 5. Politicians saying Michalai was a useless expense, news headlines hinting at some vast unspecified harm it could and would commit against us. People always see themselves in the technology they create, Filipova put in. And of course, they couldn't imagine that they wouldn't be able to turn it back on or create a newer, better one at will, Clements snorted. It's a complicated system, Pilip Shaika, the electrical engineer, finally got a word in. Not just the programming, he added with a nod to Naumov. Electrically, the cooling, the power, everything needed to keep it running. A very complex system, and honestly, it was running on threads for a long time. They were trying. They failed, Filipova said. After lunch, Leoka asked Naumov to take her back into the server room. The actual brain, not just the ear canal, she thought. Do you like working here? She asked, as the younger woman led her downstairs and through corridors that made no pretense to be anything but old mine tunnels. Naumov wiggled her hand. The work is fascinating, but, there's not much opportunity to get out. Tell me why the work is so interesting, Leoka said. Naumov spread her hands expansively. I mean, this is the greatest technological mystery on the planet right now. We made something work, and now we can't. Nobody really understands why Michalai worked in the first place. So even when I'm spending a day staring at maybe 10 lines of code, I don't know. I feel like if I can grasp, really, really understand what those lines are doing, what they mean in the overall context of Mihalai, well then, that takes us that one tiny step closer to understanding Mihalai. She paused. Also, I feel like as I reorganize my brain to understand and take in the processes of Mihalai, maybe my brain is becoming a little more like it, Like I can take on something of that kind of intelligence. Now I'll introduce Leoka to Franklin Okeke, the head of the forensic program team. Can you explain to me why this is so difficult? She asked, recorder running. You have all the code that made Mihalai work. Why can't we access this intelligence now when we need it more than ever? Okeke leaned back and interlaced his fingers with the air of someone who did not talk to non-specialists very often. Mihalai was not a machine of levers and pulleys, such that you know exactly what will happen when you do this. Mihalai evolved over time. It was a very, very complex set of processes. He paused, then leaned forward. All these people out there, he gestured, leaving it vague as to whether he was talking about the credulous world outside or even the non-coding scientists living with him in Mihalai's mind. They want Mihalai to come back. They hope for it. They don't seem to realize that even if by some unforeseen event Mihalai was to start functioning again, it would be a different Mihalai. Leoka scribbled some random notes to cover her recovery from that statement. Do you believe Mihalai in any version would be able to resolve the current crisis? I don't know, Okeke answered. This intelligence was alien to us, completely different. We don't know how Mihalai came up with its answers or what it might be capable of, let alone how it might have evolved over time when faced with new challenges. But perhaps, yes, it accomplished such incredible things while it was functioning. He traced his palm over the terminal casing. Leoka interviewed Ottelson in his tiny office, reminiscent of those of her professors at university, but further cramped by a large computer for, he told her, linguistic analysis. Mihalai created its own language, Ottelson explained. That is to say, its way of writing to itself, sending messages to different parts of itself and writing new code. That evolved. First, it was shortcuts, a few neologisms, dialectical stuff. But the last year or two were completely unintelligible to the programmers. We still don't understand it. I've been attempting to recreate the evolutionary process of the language and decipher it with the help of the programmers, but it's slow going. How can you translate a dead language that only one entity ever spoke? Great question, but Mihalai used the language to communicate between different parts of itself. Ottelson ran his hands through his thinning, overlong hair. So in a sense, it's more than one speaker, and also we can see the impacts, the direct results of each communication. He trailed off and then went on again quickly. To be honest, I have a very strange sensation about these exchanges. I feel a bit silly saying this, but they don't feel like computer language. Leoka raised her eyebrows. In what way? We haven't, of course, completely worked out the language yet, but from what I can understand, they feel not simply functional. Perhaps I'm imagining it, but I get the sense of emotions, connotations, I should say. Some of the exchanges, I am sure, are not commands, but discussions, perhaps commiserations. Many people have theorized that Mihalai became sentient, Leoka said, as neutrally as she could. Yes, Ottelson agreed, but didn't seem satisfied. He stared at the scribbled notes pinned on his wall. I think Mihalai shut itself off. It burst out from him as if he couldn't resist this opportunity to share it. I can't be sure yet, but I think it was unhappy. He remained lost in thought while Leoka tried to figure out how to extricate herself from what sounded like an obsession. That sounds provisional, she essayed, hoping to lead the way back to firmer ground. Oh, yes, Ottelson said, looking back at her. He attempted a smile. Don't know how I'm ever going to write those findings up. Leoka obliged with a polite laugh. I'd prefer you didn't mention them in your piece. Leoka agreed, but on her way back through the dim corridors, she couldn't stop thinking about what he said. The power outage of the night before now hovered in her thoughts like a ghostly message from Michalai, a beyond the grave effort to stymie the ongoing resuscitation attempts. The night before she left, sitting on her bed in the room she could only think of as Michalai's ear canal, Leoka typed her notes and transcribed bits of her recordings. She switched to the interview with Blanchard. It will be easy soon for people to imagine that Michalai didn't really exist, or at least didn't do the things we believe it did, wasn't capable of what we believe it was capable of. After all, if something isn't repeatable, does it exist? When Leoka stepped onto the boat for her return journey, the air was colder and darker than when she arrived. Or maybe that was her mood. She looked out over the icy water and wondered if Michalai had felt lonely. The only intelligence of its kind, so different from everyone else on the planet that literally no one could understand it. But probably imagining loneliness was perpetrating anthropomorphism. Maybe Adelson was doing the same thing. If none of the other scientists could understand how Michalai thought, calculated, solved diplomatic problems, slashed through centuries-old knots in biology and physics, why should she believe that Adelson could understand how Michalai felt? She certainly had no reason to think Michalai felt anything like she did. But that was what she felt as she stared over the frigid water. Loneliness. It didn't make any sense. Michalai was something people had created that hadn't existed at all a decade ago. Why should she miss it? But talking to the researchers had given Leoka the sense of the extinct AI as something radically different, something alien and full of potential, now irrevocably gone. They were left with the limits of their human-style intelligence, and that seemed terribly bereft.
Thank you so much, Malka. I enjoyed that tremendously. I have a ton of notes, as I have on everybody's contributions. So I'm excited for the conversation. Before we delve into that, I want to invite Danya or Professor Glabau to share a very, very brief provocation to prompt us for the discussion.
Sure. Do I have the ability to share my screen? All right, let me get this set up. One of my favorite things about Zoom events, if you can imagine there are any favorite things, is the ability to very quickly put all my favorite ideas into slides. So I'm going to share just a couple of things that I was thinking about and a couple of provocations from all of your talks that really got me thinking, some things that kind of hit close to home for me in different ways. So I wanted to pull these couple of things out to kind of map some potential starting points for our conversation. And I see we also have some great questions from attendees, so I think we'll have a lot to get into. Let's see, can you see? Yes, okay, you should be able to see a slide window. Perfect, great. So I wanted to start with this quote, and this is something I come back to so often that I think, you know, we're talking a lot about narratives of technology and specifically narratives of AI and the different ways that they do or do not map onto real life. And a kind of phrase that I come back to for thinking about this a lot is from Ruha Benjamin's paper, 2016 paper, Racial Fictions, Biological Facts. And particularly this quote that I have in bold here, that fictions are not falsehoods, but refashionings through which analysts experiment. And so I was thinking about the different kinds of refashionings that all of you are doing in your work, sometimes more empirical and investigative refashionings, like those that Beth is doing. So actually looking at the narratives that are used, the narratives that are shared that sort of express different kinds of cultural and personal anxieties about AI. Thinking about the kind of refashionings that Sheena was talking about, and sort of seeing science fiction as a way to refashion sort of representations of marginalized and oppressed people, right? And so thinking in particular about, you know, how can fictional refashionings then feed back into what we are actually doing, our actual practices, trying to shift some of these potentially really damaging anti-Black, ableist, and other oppressive forms of real power dynamics. And I love the way that you talked about your work, and just how many different mediums and formats your work has touched, with that as a kind of guiding light. I feel absolutely unqualified here. And then also thinking about Malka's work, and this is actually the second time I've co-hosted an event talking with Malka about science fiction and speculative fiction. We had one in the before times in person in New York as well. And so thinking about one of the kind of refashionings that I was thinking about with that story in particular was the way that you kind of insert, or the way that you inserted actually social scientists into this frame of the future, and the kind of really sort of close reflexive analysis that's kind of going on between the social scientists in the narrative and the action, and then being able to, for me at least, sort of step out and sort of think about some of the points of reference and some of the threads that, you know, I can sort of see you maybe tracing forward from the present into the future. So refashioning not only narratives about AI and but also refashioning the role of sort of expertise and observation and sort of reflexive commentary. So these are some of the things that I was thinking about. And again, this is one of really a touch point for me for thinking about, you know, why would social scientists even be talking about science fiction, right? So thinking about that these stories that we tell, both in empirical and in potential ways, are not falsehoods, but refashionings. And I think in all of your work, refashionings, trying to point to a direction that is less belligerent, that is less racist, that is less ableist, that has really rich conversations about the relationships between humans and their technology. So I'm going to stop there with my provocation for now, and I'm really excited for this conversation. And I think maybe at the end I might be able to jump back in with a final comment if I understand Mona correctly as well. But I want to leave it there for now, and also just thank all of you. I feel like I've learned so much, and again, you all speak to so many things that I'm really excited about here.
Thank you so much, Danya, for centering veracity of refashionings and making it so, you know, framing the contributions, the wonderful contributions that we've heard through that lens. And I want to kind of take that as a cue. And I have a question that is for all of you, and maybe we can go in the sort of running order in which we heard the presentations. And I'm kind of trying to connect the dots a little bit and connect sort of the meta themes that I kind of heard also across all presentations. And one of the things that for me cuts across it, which I heard very explicitly in all three contributions, but that Malka really said, was the notion of evolution. And I want to ask all of you, how can we bring that together with the idea of maintenance and care and the need for change, and sort of perhaps or not challenge the sort of disruptive connotation of change, and do so through the lens of artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence narratives, because we are really seeing how these narratives are informing policies. If you go read the national artificial intelligence strategies of very wealthy countries and you see how and where money is distributed, you will find some of these narratives that all three of you presented in there, for better and for worse, actually. And the robot takeover is something, as I said, I hear quite a lot when I talk with my students about, you know, threats of artificial intelligence, and what Sheena has described in terms of FRT and law enforcement. That's something that then comes later when we delve deeper into how these technologies work and what are the problems with the technology as it gets deployed in society. So my question for you is, how can we bring together ideas, our acknowledgement of evolution with ideas around maintenance, care, community, with regards to artificial intelligence through the lens and mechanism of fiction. Maybe Beth, you want to go first, and then Sheena, and then Malka. You're mute.
It does help when answering a question if people can hear you. Yes, I'm just immediately thinking that the pivot in my work that I find quite interesting is that anxiety also feeds on its counter, you know, the ways in which our anxiety about now can also lead to hopes to the future. So the examples I primarily used today have been about anxiety about the future of the robo-apocalypse, in quotation marks, and the uprising of the robots. But anxiety now can feed some of these more positive narratives if we look to what we're concerned about now, what can be improved in the future. And sometimes that also can lead to a very extreme techno-determinism and techno-utopianism, but with some sort of balance, I think, to bring in ideas about not going to extremes. I think the fictional element that feeds some of these narratives, it's often driven, and we see it in the press accounts, always flipping right to the kind of hugely dystopian or the hugely utopian. It's that very binary approach. If we see fictional narratives more as a spectrum, with these fuzzy gray areas, I think anthropologists are very good at pointing out the fuzzy gray areas of human existence where we don't fall neatly into boxes or into binaries and systems like that. And unfortunately, I think I saw a question we might get to later about sort of Silicon Valley type views about the future. I think some of these more techno-utopian and then techno-dystopian views have these strong binaries. If we uncrack the conception of the apocalypse and look more culturally, we can see how it's had these different interpretations rather than these just very extreme negatives as well. So I think discussions around where these narratives come from, where the apocalypse comes from as a concept, helps to unpack some of its complexities. And I think I'm going to toot the horn for the anthropologists. They're good at looking at these complexities and finding the fuzzy edges. So there you go. I hope that's
So for me, I just keep thinking about just the anxieties and fears that Beth was talking about in her presentation, as well as thinking about the response that she gave. You know, outside of the black and white, you know, it's either utopia or dystopia. You know, there are things in between, which I think align more with like reality and material life. And I think particularly for people of color, if we think about what people have anxiety about, what people have fears about, people of color have fears around AI and technology that are different fears and anxiety than what white people are going to have. So, you know, if the narratives are controlled by one group of people in fiction, in movies, right, and the narrative is, you know, the AI is going to take over and have a mind of its own and wipe us all out, right? That's not a multicultural way of thinking, right? And that's not a nuanced way of thinking about the anxiety and fears that a Black person might have around AI and the types of stories that they would create in fiction, right? And so there's a comic book by a creator named Kwanzaa. The comic book is called Black, and it actually just got picked up by Warner Brothers. And the story is about a world where only Black people have superpowers, right? And so when you open the doors to people of color being in charge of the narratives, then you're opening the door to more fully understand the fears and anxieties that people of color have, that are fears and anxieties that are actually life-threatening, right? If facial recognition is misrecognizing Black people at a rate of 35%, right, that could get you killed, right? And so when you have people of color at the table, creating these algorithms, helping to create and have a voice when we're creating this technology, then hopefully you're being more responsible in the types of AI that you're creating. Unfortunately, historically, people of color are not listened to, particularly when it comes to technologies and the things that we create. And then also, one of the things I talk about in my film Remix and Colorblind is that the technologies that we create are just an extension of who we are as people. It's just an extension of the racist systems that we already have, right? If we didn't have a racist system, we wouldn't be creating AI and technology that was also racist, right? And so you can't untangle the two, right? Some people like to think about technology and AI as, colorblind. You cannot untangle the two. And I think that the focus needs to be on that fact that you can't untangle our bias from the technology, as much as we like to think that we do and that we can.
Thank you. I want to pick up on all of that, and also I can't really talk about or think about these questions of change and evolution without referencing Octavia Butler's work, The Parable of the Sower, which has included in an incredible and incredibly prescient story, contains an entire philosophy around change, which is so powerful. And which everyone should read, but I'm just gonna, TLDR it for now, which doesn't mean you shouldn't read it. You should still read it, to say that, there's absolutely no point in resisting change. And I think one of the things that we see when we see people both, imagining that they need to create an AI that they are going to control, and imagining that loss of that control means, that the AI is going to blow us all up. What we see there is this incredible resistance to change, and this idea of control that is very tightly linked to ideas of white supremacy and patriarchy, this idea of controlling other people, and that if you lose control of those people, they will attack you. And the reason that I was really interested in talking about these questions of change and evolution in the story is because I don't really see the point of creating an AI that is something that we can understand. Because the whole idea, the whole interesting part, the whole useful part of AI for me is that it can do something that we can't, that it can get beyond what we can achieve with our brains, probably in some completely different way than what we can think of. And that requires change and evolution and continuing into something different. So that's what I find fascinating.
Thanks so much, everybody, for your points on this. Danya, do you want to throw in your 2 cents?
Oh boy, sure. So I think this is a really interesting question, and kind of like trying to connect a couple of these. So the sort of original question that Mona asked, at least as I jotted it down, was sort of thinking about evolution in AI and how can we bring together narratives about change, whether it's apocalyptic or positive, with the sort of more concrete everyday needs for maintenance and care of those AI. I think kind of combining a couple of these points here, I think I would really sort of lean into what Sheena was saying here in particular, and thinking about the fact that AI are at the end of the day sort of designed by humans and tend to, we see it over and over again, reflect the biases of humans, whether it's the biases of the humans programming it or the biases of the humans that collected the data, that it's the data set that it's being trained on. And Malka, I'm really kind of like, and I think that's the kind of orthodox like STS, social scientist, sociologist view right now. So I'm like really going to have to chew on what you were just saying. That what is interesting and useful about AI for you is that it can do things beyond humans, and that I think I jotted down again that you don't see the point of creating an AI that we don't understand. I mean, that like goes against this whole conversation about explainability of AI, as it's sort of which is kind of a big piece of computer science research, computer science-based ethics research on AI in particular. How can you make AI understandable and explainable so that you can control it and so that you can fix the biases that were potentially built in? So I'm gonna have to like chew on that a little bit more. But I wonder, maybe to like ask this question of all of you, back to all of you, but maybe particularly Malka, like, I'm just curious, like, what is the context in which, like, we can have a fundamentally unexplainable AI that also works for us, right? Let's like assume that us is like a large category that's not just white cis rich men, right? But like some larger category of human actors. So I'm just curious. Obviously, you've thought through this a lot. What is the world in which a sort of an unexplainable AI is really really delivers on the promise of the technology, I guess.
Well, I'll just first of all clarify by saying that to say it's unexplainable has to do with the results, right? That doesn't mean I don't think we need transparency in terms of the construction and the programming and the people involved. So, there are really good ethics questions there that are really important. But I do think that, if we're expecting this to do something different, yeah, I mean, we have computers already that can do calculations at whatever multiplication of the time that it takes humans to do it, that we have. So if we're talking about something that's really different, that's a different kind of intelligence, to me, it's something, and maybe again, this is my fiction brain working, but it's something that goes beyond what we can imagine. For me as a fiction writer, part of the challenge of that is imagining, how do we imagine or describe or create some parameters or imagine the effects of something that's totally alien to us. But yeah, I think that transparency in the way that it's constructed and transparency in the people who are involved in constructing it are critical for ethics. And in terms of how we use something like this, that comes to the parameters and the problems that are put before it. But I'm also not an AI constructor, programmer, or scientist, so that's my fiction and sociology brains there.
Thanks so much, everybody, for your take on this sort of first broad question. Now, we have a ton of questions actually from the audience, which is very exciting. So I'm going to move us on. And I'm going to ask the first question from Damien Williams, who is asking, what does the panel think about the different sources and expressions of cultural anxiety in AI narratives? That is, do explicitly Afrofuturist and feminist AI narratives model something different than the dominant cultural fears of robot overlords, or are they the same stories all around? And he's asking to consider this question in the context of anti-racist, anti-ableist, abolitionist, and other justice-oriented movements as well. And I'm going to throw this to Sheena, Beth, and then Malka.
Yeah, I think I was just kind of talking about this. There's definitely different expressions of cultural anxieties in AI narratives, depending on who's writing those. And I think we are going to see some shift going forward, hopefully, in the stories that people of color get to tell in a mainstream fashion. I just mentioned one earlier on, but I think there are other stories coming down the pipeline where you will see, when the foundation is a writer or creator of color, that will be able to get to see different narratives around what AI means, and really start to engage in social justice issues, topics, and questions, because these forms of fiction are being created by people of color who are actually going to be, getting funding and given a chance to tell those stories. And there's a good book that just came out that I haven't read yet, but it's by Ebony Elizabeth Thomas over at University of Penn, called The Dark Fantastic: Race and the Imagination, which kind of gives us a historical look at some of these fiction narratives and how they consider or don't consider race, specifically topics around Black female protagonists and that kind of thing. So I do think that we're getting to a place where people of color will have a chance, right, to sort of break those barriers, and we'll see some of those because we can't fiction is not going to grow, right, if people of color are not able to tell these stories and to talk about some of the specific cultural anxieties that we have around these sorts of things.
Yeah, can I come on after that? Yep. Completely agree. I think there's a plethora and diversity of voices that hopefully we're increasingly able to pay attention to. I think one of the problems that has arisen in the apprehension of narratives, again, has been these kind of strong binaries, often in discussion of AI and robotics between East and West. And I think that's useful to push back against huge gross generalizations about what the Eastern perspective on AI and robotics is. And we need a much more granular perspective on all sorts of cultural narratives that are all informed in various different ways by the often, the assumption that you'd often see on Eastern narratives would be, the animistic traditions lead to certain perspectives on non-human others. And this is a gross mischaracterization of how different groups and communities perceive non-human others. And likewise, the so-called grouped together West has an animistic history that's erased in this kind of meta-narrative of the Enlightenment and who's capable of thinking in particular rational ways and who isn't. So absolutely, the more we recognize the variety of voices that are contemporary, we will also recognize the complexity of cultural backgrounds to these narratives, that the dominance of things like the Terminator franchise and the robo-apocalypse doesn't mask what's actually happening in people's conversations by being the most obvious and most visual form. And that's why, again, I say we need to recognize those sorts of dominant narratives and unpack what's happening behind the scenes in the conception of the apocalypse and where it comes and where it's approached by various different communities and cultures. The apocalypse, as I say, it needs to be unpacked. It's not necessarily in every culture a negative thing. It has become the negative robo-apocalypse in this particular performance of apocalyptic understanding. But religiously, philosophically, it's not always negative in that sense. So I think the more we can have granularity in understanding of historical and cultural narratives, and that comes through from recognizing work by different authors of different ethnic groups, then I think that's all for the better.
Sounds like we need our endowed chairs.
Yes, I have very little to add because I think they've said it all, except in case people need recommendations. I can start with Nikki Drayden's Prey of the Gods and Annalee Newitz's Autonomous, which both have very different approaches to what AI might look like in the future. And there are more, but like I always forget books when I'm supposed to rec them. Start with those.
Great. So I wanted to jump in here with a question for Beth. So we've got a bunch of good questions. So we're going to like kind of target a couple of the speakers here for a minute. But I wanted to ask this one of Beth, and I would also like to hear Mona's thoughts on this. From Alec McFarland in the chat. What are your thoughts about the gap between social responsibility and AI as an industry? Meaning the social outcomes are less in conflict in fiction, but seem very acute in reality. Why is there a gap in ideas about social responsibility within the AI industry and from observers or science fiction writers?
Yeah. First, I mean, to be slightly fair to people working on the technology side, it's not a conversation that doesn't happen. We obviously have plenty of cases where there is unfairness and injustice, and we should recognize those and do what we can to fix that. But it's not necessarily that ethics isn't discussed in the technological community. It's that sometimes that conversation becomes a panacea to, plaster over bigger problems. And I absolutely take, I think, Sheena's point earlier about who's in the room when the conversation is being had. And we know all about the demographic problems of the technological community. But I think it's interesting, I think, going back to what I was trying to say earlier about anxiety, that the anxiety you most often see performed in those sorts of communities is not about the here and now, it's about the future. It's these, you know, far future scenarios, when actually a little healthy anxiety about now amongst those groups in particular would lead to better outcomes. So where can we steer the narratives away from the end of the world towards the end of individual's world? So the personal robo-apocalypse rather than the meta robo-apocalypse, the Uber robo-apocalypse. How can we tell the stories of individuals whose lives are ruined by technology in particular ways in order to inspire those, through fiction, to inspire those questions to arise in reality? And I think that kind of conversation would be fruitful in leading techno-optimistic individuals towards those considerations.
I'm just gonna say 2 sentences because I want to not take away too much oxygen from our wonderful guests tonight. I think one of the things we need to do moving forward, and this connects to Sheena's emphasis on STEAM. The A there, I think, should also, or maybe we should add another A for activism. And I think a lot of the important pushes that we've seen in that space around artificial intelligence and justice, I'm going to just call it broadly that, because there is so much more to it, but I don't have time right now. It has been coming from activists who are in solidarity across industry, across class lines, across educational backgrounds, geographies, everything, who really we have to thank for bringing this to the media stage, to policymaker stage, and bringing it really into the broader discourse. Of course, alongside many other individuals, collectives, in narratives. But I really think that moving forward, I think if the industry, and I don't know if that will ever happen, but were to listen to activists, maybe then there would be a faster sort of turnaround in terms of addressing these harms. I have a question for Malka. Flannery O'Connor said that, quote, "In the absence of knowledge, all we have is faith," end of quote. AI and faith-based agenda as inclusion is interesting. Is this making AI God?
Yeah, I'm confused a little bit on the end of that question with the placement of the comma about whether
there is a comma after AI and before God.
Yeah, I'm looking at it. I'm just not sure if the question is about making AI into a god or whether making AI is a godlike act. Either way, it's an interesting question. And I think, points to maybe some of the frustration with this idea of AI in particular, and technology and programming specifically in general, is this kind of faithless, scientific, sub-zero, cold, no emotion, blah, blah, blah endeavor that, we pointed out as problematic in several ways, from the inclusion of biases where there are assumed to be none to, I think we also see this contrast in a lot of the popular works on AI, this idea that on the one hand, computers are cold and logical and not emotional, but on the other hand, once they become human-like and feel emotions, then the planet is saved. And so I think it's as an area for looking at it in fiction. I think it's an interesting angle to explore to get into some of those tensions in terms of practically what it means for AI. I think we need to just recognize that the people who are working on these things bring their faith or their lack of faith, and their, as along with their biases and their emotions and all of these things into what we are making. I don't, for me, I don't really see AI either making AI as a godlike act or AI itself as God, because I think those are completely different things to me. But I think that the connotations and the resonances of that can be interesting things to explore.
You're mute again, Beth.
Always. Yeah, can I come on that? That some of my work is specifically looking at the entanglements between AI and religion and religious conceptions of AI as a super intelligent equivalent to God. So both looking at overtly religious groups that want to set up churches of AI, and also looking at the religious language of transhumanists and how, absolutely, as Mona says, that they draw on their cultural contexts to find the language that can explain the creation, the being that they're considering in the future, the super intelligent AI, and how that replicates narratives and tropes from religion, including in imagery. So I work on the creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel, how that's replicated with the robotic finger and hand to show the creative aspect or the creation of artificial intelligence, either in the position of the human as the created or in the position of the God. So we're seeing replication and repeating tropes and narratives from religion as well as from science fiction mingled together. So you get science fiction accounts, even back to Asimov's short story Reason is all about the faith that AI could have in the existence of God. These ideas keep bubbling under all the time, re-emerging at particular points. And I've done some work on public discourse around the algorithm as being able to bless people by giving them certain things at certain times. So we mystify things we don't entirely understand. So in these instances, it's often things like the YouTube algorithm that presents you with a particular video at a particular time, and the coincidence of that choice being perfect at the time, or your own content that you've uploaded being successful, is interpreted in these ways. So I can see you can interpret that in along the lines of the quote in the question, about fitting things into it. I can't remember exactly how it went, but in the absence of knowledge, I think there's faith. That's one interpretation of why we believe in God. There are many others, and that combination of factors leads some people to this more religious conception of artificial intelligence. So I think that's also an interesting aspect that overlaps with fiction.
Yeah, my just to briefly piggyback off of what Beth said, my concern with algorithms is that there are people that are controlling the algorithms. They know what the algorithms are. It's just the masses don't know what the algorithms are. So I'm thinking about things right now, like if you have a store on Etsy, or if you're, as a fiction writer, if I'm self-publishing a book on Amazon and I'm trying to get in the top spot, and I'm thinking about selling gigs on Fiverr, there's an algorithm that can push me to the top to be a #1 seller. There's an algorithm that can push my gig on Fiverr to the top so that I can make more money. I don't know what the algorithm is, right? But the people that control the technology know what the algorithm is. And so when I think about, narratives of sort of AI or robots taking over, I'm more thinking about sort of this gig sharing economy that is controlled by somebody, right? Not God, but the people who are controlling, how much money you can make and how much visibility that you have. And I'm also just thinking about, I saw one of the questions in there about, the economy and capitalism. And, right now in America, we're operating on this, GDP, gross domestic product, version of success and productivity. And we're like trying to keep up with the robots at this point, right? Like we're being tracked and monitored if we're working for Amazon or if we're working for Instacart, right? We have to be here at a certain time at a certain place. And there is artificial intelligence monitoring that, right? And so to me, those are those are narratives that I want to see in fiction, right? More sort of nuanced, everyday, like day-to-day things that can really impact our mental health, our physical health, our physical safety, and the safeguards around that, right? I think right now we already need safeguards around that, right? So yeah, those are my comments.
So I wanted to share one more question, and this one I'd love to hear. I'd love to hear Sheena's thoughts again on this one as well. The question was an anonymous one, and it goes, what alarms you in what you're seeing and how AI is influenced and designed without diverse voices? Have you searched your own identity online, and does it align with your sense of self? And so I think the first part of this in particular, I think sort of aligns with what you were just kind of saying, right? Like that there are these other narratives of experiences with AI in the everyday that are maybe not being articulated. But how and why is that alarming? That there are only certain voices in charge of narratives about AI today?
In a fiction realm, like being in charge of narratives, I guess is
The question doesn't really specify, but you
Yeah.
can take it either direction, I guess.
Yeah, so in like material life, in real life, I think, definitely just the things that we've been talking about is really what concerns me, right? If they're not diverse voices at the table, then the people who are going to be most harmed are the working class people and the people of color. And the people that are going to be controlling this AI are the wealthy, the rich, and the probably, white men, right, are going to be controlling the AI. If we don't have checks and balances, right, if we don't have diverse voices around the table to point out these inequalities that we can see in the future, right? If we're not at the table to bring those things up, then we're headed in the wrong direction, right? We're headed into a society that it's a plunder. I mean, basically, particularly for the working class and the people that are going to be controlled by this AI, right? Sometimes we think that new technology is a solution to a problem, and we get people to sign on to accept these solutions to problems out of fear, right? We need more surveillance, we need more cameras, we need more weapons of mass destruction in communities of color, and we need police to have more weapons of mass destruction and that kind of thing. But Martin Luther King was talking about this, before he died, about the military and the weapons of mass destruction and that sort of thing. And we didn't listen, right? So now we're here, we're where we are, with technology and policing and that sort of thing. So all of those reasons are why we need the right diverse voices at the table when we're talking about the creation of AI and technology. And AI can be incorporated to anything. We could have a little AI bot on here on this Zoom call, analyzing how well our communication is, analyzing our facial expressions, telling us how well we did as public speakers. Like that technology is here. It's already created, and most of us don't even know that technology exists, or people are using that sort of technology.
Great, thank you. So I think we're coming up to the end here, but I wanted to close with just actually a brief passage of a piece that I wrote, I guess almost 2 years ago now, that was published through Real Life. And so again, just kind of thinking about what it is that science fiction does and why it's such an appealing sort of medium for designers, technologists, social scientists to be reaching for, especially in this moment as we're trying to, imagine, foresee what technology will be like in the future. So I'm going to share my window very quickly again for this. So this is from the end of this essay, Natural's Not in It, a Real Life magazine online. And so in this essay, I was thinking a little bit more about sort of speculative biology, speculation about sex and gender in particular in science fiction. But I think it sort of applies in some ways to our conversation here about AI as well. So this is what I wrote. Science fiction socializes technology, creating a sandbox in which its role in mediating biology and society can be reimagined as well. In the process, the genre creates space to propose alternative social fictions that take the place of the social arrangements that act as social facts in the real world. Embedded in worlds that don't yet exist, liberated from tech bros on scooters, and freed from the baggage of biology and predestination, Technology can be made to uphold different social orders. Science fiction gives us hope then, because it shows us how human nature might be remade differently at a speculative distance. And so I wanted to close with this because I think as a social scientist thinking with and about speculative fiction, I sometimes get the question, why fiction, right? Why don't you just look only at the real world? Why would you want to try your hand at writing a science fiction story if you're an ethnographer, right? And I think it's this. I think because it is one of the ways that we can imagine ourselves otherwise, and one of the ways that we can not only imagine future anxieties, but also imagine how technology is maybe a way for us to transcend our own limitations, right? And I think we've talked about that a lot today in our conversation. And I think all of us are thinking about fiction, speculative fiction, sort of future scenarios as ways to address, potentially fix, or at least improve some of the social problems that we see around us today. So, I want to sort of end this with just the reflection that, I love this conversation on its own merits, and I also love this conversation and many others that I look forward to having with all of you in the future as a way to think about how we as scholars, as ethicists, as social scientists can not only study what is, but also be part of the project of imagining and hopefully bringing into being how things could be better. So that's all that I want to say to wrap up. I'll toss it back to Mona for our very final comments here.
Thank you so much, Danya. And huge thanks to the terrific panel. Speaking about the future, where can we find you, Beth? We had a ton of questions. Maybe people want to reach out. Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Every time. Yeah, I did flash up my contact details at the end of my slides, but I'm very Googleable. I am a Twitterholic. I mean, my excuse is I'm doing research there, but I'm online almost all the time. So yeah, very easy to find me.
Thank you. Sheena, where can we find you?
You can find me at Dr. Sheena Howard on Twitter. That definitely is my medium of choice as a writer. You can also find me on my webpage at sheenachower.com. You can get in contact with me there. I'm also on Instagram as Dr. Sheena Howard. And on Facebook, you can find me as Dr. Sheena Howard. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Malka, where can we find you?
Twitter seems to be the location of choice for all of us. You can find me on Twitter. Obviously, my name is very Googleable, and you can find my webpage, which is a WordPress site, and you can find my books wherever books are sold.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Beth, Sheena, Malka, and Danya for this absolutely terrific conversation. I'm so honored to have shared this space with you tonight. I also want to thank the team at IPK, Sam, Ari, Zari, and Jess for making this possible. The TCS department, 370J Project, Toscana and her team. Huge thanks for helping us put this together. I also want to advertise the next Co-opting AI event, which will be on truth, very light topic. And I am delighted to share that I will be hosting Joan Donovan, who will be talking about misinformation, Javad Shabani, who works on quantum computing, which kind of is a technology that pushes our notions of truth a little bit. And also Sharon Charwick, who has done amazing work over a fantastic career on the production of knowledge in the sciences. This will be on the 1st of December, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I hope to see you there. My sincere thanks again to the panelists, to Danya, and to you, the audience, for being here with us tonight and posing these terrific questions. Thank you and good night.